The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is Christy Sullivan, and I'm the Secretary of the American Society for Cellular and Computational Toxicology. Welcome to our webinar today. It's presented by ASCCT in cooperation with the European Society for Toxicology in Vitro. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that is one of our efforts, both societies together, to provide training and engagement for scientists around the world on new approach methodologies. So first, some general housekeeping. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be posted on the ASCCT website in a few days, and everyone will receive a PDF of the slides as well. Your lines are all muted. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after each presentation. After the presentation using the question module. So the presenter will give their presentation, and while he's presenting, please feel free to type in your question to the question module, and that way when we come to the Q&A, we've got some questions ready. You can also reach us if you're having technical issues with the chat box, or you can email me. I just wanted to give some quick announcements. First of all, just a reminder that the ESTIV International Congress has been postponed from June of 2020 to June of 2022. And it will still be held in Barcelona, so please look out for more information on that. Also, the annual ASCCT meeting will be held the week of October 19th. We had originally planned for an in-person meeting, but given all of the uncertainties related to the current pandemic, we are going to go ahead and make it a virtual meeting. And I think probably we'll expand it out to more than 2 days so that we can have shorter days. We're also going to be looking to provide platforms for engagement amongst attendees online and poster sessions. So we'll aim to have a good meeting anyway, even though it will be online. And we have a really nice set of confirmed plenary speakers you can see on your screen there from different sectors of toxicology. So we're really looking forward to that meeting. Please feel free to submit an abstract. The deadline is July 31st, and you can find more information on the website as well as submitting your abstract. And then finally, our next webinar is going to be in a couple of weeks with Dr. Tim Allen from the University of Cambridge. He was a planned plenary speaker at the ESTIV meeting, so that will be the week of the ESTIV meeting. So we're trying to provide some programming for that postponed meeting anyway. Registration is not available yet. It should be available very soon on the website. And you can find that registration once it appears on the page in front of you, ascctalks.org/webinars. You can also see an archive of all of the webinars that we have recorded. So for today's presentation, I first wanted to call your attention to a webinar that was recorded in January by Dr. Mansouri, our presenter today, and Dr. Nicole Kleinstreuer on the Collaborative Acute Toxicity Modeling Suite. It's a long webinar that has a really nice detailed background of the modeling suite and goes through some examples and really gives a good in-depth dive into CAPMOS. So I encourage you to check out that webinar as well. It's part of a series that a couple of organizations, the PETA International Science Consortium, EPA, and Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine have pulled together and hold regularly. You can find it at this website on your screen, and that will give you a nice background into some of what Dr. Mansouri is going to present today, which will include CAPMOS and also 2 other models. So his title today is International Computational Collaborations for Predictive Toxicology. I'll just introduce our speaker now. Dr. Mansouri is leading the computational chemistry efforts at Integrated Laboratory Systems, supporting the NTP Interagency Center for the Evaluation of Alternative Toxicological Methods at the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. He's working on several projects involving QSAR modeling, cheminformatics, and computational toxicology. Dr. Mansouri is known for his international collaborations and leading consortiums of renowned scientists in the field of QSARs and computational toxicology. And in 2017, he won the Lush Prize for developing in silico alternatives to animal testing for endocrine disruptor screening. So with that, I will ask you to go ahead, Dr. Mansouri. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining today. Do you see my first slide full screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks again. So as Christy said, today we're going to be talking about the international collaborations that we organized for the last few years about different endpoints, about endocrine disruptors, estrogen and androgen, as well as acute oral toxicity. So the outline of the presentation today will be a little bit of background about the three projects, the collaborators, the modeling efforts that made models available and then possible, and the consensus models that were combined together using all the models from the participants, and then how to run the models in the Opera tool. So these are the three projects that I'll be talking about today. So SIRAP, it's about modeling the estrogen receptor, and Compara about modeling the androgen receptor. So those two were part of the EDSP program at the EPA, US EPA, and then CATMOS, which is about modeling acute oral toxicity, and it was organized by ICVAM. EPA also was part of that, as it's a member of ICVAM, and all three models are now completed and available in Opera. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that later on. So the collaborators that made all this possible are over 100 scientists from all around the world. They are from academia, industry, and governmental institutions. They are from, as I said, from the US, South America, Europe, Asia, and they are good modelers, but not only modelers, also computational chemists and scientists who have good background that helped us really make all this possible. So I'll be first starting with SIRAP and Compara, since they are both part of EDSP, and then CATMOS. So for SIRAP and Compara, they were really a way that the EPA started doing these few last years of modeling in silico endpoints. So providing models to predict certain endpoints that usually take a lot of time and efforts, and of course to reduce the use of animal testing, but also in vitro testing takes time and costs a lot of taxpayers' money. So these tools are really to speed up the process, but also to make good predictions, accurate predictions, and that are fast and easy to use to make like a pre-screening of chemicals, thousands or hundreds of thousands of chemicals in a very fast and accurate way. at least as a first step before in vitro testing. So within ADSP, we have these two projects that were based on the TOX21 and TOXCAS projects. So as you probably know, in TOXCAS, TOX21, there are a lot of assays for screening in vitro ER and AR pathways. And Dr. Judson and Dr. Klanstroyers, including other scientists, they were able to develop these pathway models that combine different assays all through the ER and AR pathway, and combine them together using a scoring function that was then modeled in a way to make predictions whether a chemical would be an active in the ER pathway or in the AR pathway. So those scores were used both in Syrup and Compara as a beginning to provide a training set for those models. So all those AUC scores were split into using thresholds, of course, and then we decided on which chemicals are actives and inactives, and that data went through a thorough curation to build these training data sets. And as you can see in the table below, those are the numbers of actives and inactives in TOXCAS chemicals. So of course, these in both cases, the number of actives is very, very low in comparison to inactives. And that's really the challenge of these two models. And that's why we needed all these great models to help us with that challenge, because combining different tools and modeling techniques and algorithms and descriptors all together and make a consensus call was proven to be better and more accurate than a single model. And also the applicability domain of those models of the consensus model improves over the single models. And as a first step for both projects, we prepared a prediction set, which is like a preliminary list of chemicals that the EPA was interested in. So as you can see, the ADSP universe, of course, which is the main project, and then some other lists of chemicals that were first prepared for Syrup, and then Compara took third from that list, and then we also included some other chemicals, including some TOXCAS metabolites, generated metabolites. And all those structures, of course, were standardized and made use already, and we're gonna be talking a little bit more about that process later on. So for both projects, we received a lot of models. So about 50 models for Syrup, which was the first project, and then Compara almost doubled the number of models to about 291. And all those models combined together were really clearly made it possible to combine them into consensus models, because as you can see in the histograms below, that's the coverage of those models for the chemicals in the prediction set. So remember the previous slide, the number of lists of interest. So that's the number of models in the x-axis and the number of structures on the y-axis. So each one of the chemicals in those lists were covered by at least 10 models for each of the projects, and most of them were covered by about 18 to 30 models for Compara. So that's a very high number, and it makes it statistically possible to combine them into consensus models, and that also increases the applicability domain of the model. So the consensus is now covering up all those chemicals. 30,000 for syrup and about 50,000 for Compara. So then after we combined those chemical or those models together, we evaluated the consensus models using some evaluation set that we curated from the literature. And the same evaluation set, of course, was used to kind of validate or evaluate the accuracy of the single models, just to make sure that none of the models were mismatching chemicals to experimental data or things like that. But of course, both projects or all three projects were just collaborations. It wasn't a comparison of any sort. There was no comparison. The goal was to combine them together into consensus models to have better accuracy and better coverage for the chemicals, and to make it useful for everybody later on as an available suite to process and predict other new chemicals. So both consensus models showed very high accuracy, balanced accuracy, but also sensitivity and specificity, because both models focused on classification. So there was, for each one of them, a binding, an agonist, and an antagonist consensus model. And all those three were also combined together in a way that they make sense together, because models coming from binding were completely separate and independent from agonists, for example. But then we combine them together in a way that if it's an agonist or an antagonist, of course, it makes more sense that it's also binding to the site as well. So that's how we combined them together. With that, I'm moving to CATMOS. So as Christy said, for CATMOS, we already have that recorded webinar a couple months ago where Nicole talked about the modeling, and I showed or demonstrated how to use the Opera to make predictions. But also for the previous project, I presented those two models in different presentations. So you probably saw some of the slides, but I'd be happy to answer questions later on. And I can also point to those presentations just to go fast so that we can get to the latest updates. So for CATMOS, there was this publication a while ago about the how to make acute oral toxicity data available, and which uses for this data, and how to make it also available to help with the regulatory process. So after this effort from the acute tox work group, we were able to get these 5 endpoints that as the most important endpoints for this process of modeling the acute oral toxicity. So as you can see, we have a point estimate, which is the continuous model or the continuous data set, and it's about LD50 values. And then the remaining ones are classification models or categorical data sets. So binary models, 2 of them, one for toxic and non-toxic and very toxic, and then 2 of multi-categorical or multi-classification models that are about EPA categories and GHS categories. So all these are based on thresholds, as you can see, and different classes of chemicals fall within different categories based on their LD50 points estimates. However, each one of these endpoints were modeled separately just to make sure that the combined consensus model later on makes the most of each one of those data sets. So, and then combining them also increases the applicability domain of the consensus model itself. Just as I mentioned earlier with the syrup and Compara, we had this QSAR-ready standardization workflow that was used to standardize the chemical structures and to have, of course, accurate structures for modeling, but also to get each one of the data sets separately and have each one of the models build model, each one of the participants build their models on each one of the data sets, but also to keep them coherently and possible to include them and combine them together later on. So as you can see, the 5 data sets have different numbers of entries, but of course those are overlapping just because, for example, we don't have LD50 for all of the chemicals that we have in the data set, the 12,000 initial list of structures, but we have some sort of range that can be used to decide whether it's in API category 1 or 2 or 3 or GHS, you know, which category for those multiple classification endpoints. The way we conducted or pre-processed the data set that we had in hand, so that it contains a training set and an evaluation set, but also so that the evaluation set that will be used for the evaluation and of the different models as well as the consensus is representative of the training set. So we did a splitting of 25 to 75% that is semi-automatic or in a way that, for example, the LD50 values have similar distribution as in the test set as in the training set, but also the structures and their origin or sources are also split in a similar distribution, just to make sure that the evaluation results are representative of the modeling accuracy. And as we did for CRF and Compara, we had a prediction set to start with. So for CATMOS, we had some of them are also overlapping with the CRF and Compara lists of chemicals, but some additional lists were of course investigated, like the TASCA list of chemicals. And after standardization of the structure, we had about 50,000 structures. And just to mention that here, we included the evaluation set, of course, to make it also predicted by the different participants so that we can use it as evaluation of the accuracy of the models separately and the consensus later on. We received about 140 models, and that, of course, split between the different 5 endpoints. As you can see, LD50 received lower number of models, but that's just because it's harder to predict the LD50 in comparison to binary models, for example, like very toxic and non-toxic models, which is just 2 categories. And also it is harder to predict like 5 categories. A model with 5 category classifications is harder than binary. However, just as we showed earlier for CRF and Compara, we had a really good coverage. So about 20 models for the LD50 and the multiple classification models, and even higher than that, 25 to 26 models for the binary model. So that's very high coverage. And just to mention that this is something that we established based on the CRF and Compara models, is that the higher the concordance between the single models, the more accurate the combined consensus prediction will be. So when you look at the histogram on the right side of the screen, the lower right side, you'll see the concordance between the different models. And as you can see, there is a very high concordance between the models, meaning they predict about the same thing. Of course, there are some differences, and the easier the model, the more concordant the predictions will be. Like, as you can see, for very toxic and non-toxic that our binary model is easier, so the predictions will be more concordant between everybody. Well, some differences between EPA and GHS, for example, because those are based on thresholds, and just a prediction of 51 versus 49 LD50 can make a difference of classification to which category. But they are also, we did some additional analysis, and the concordance when it comes to very close predictions, it makes things even more concordant. As we did for Syrup and Compara, but it was easier for those two projects because we only had 3 models that are somehow related to agonist, antagonist, and binding. Here we had 5 endpoints. So as I said, the 5 endpoints were modeled separately. So after the first evaluation and combining the models together, we had 5 different consensus models. So for each one of the endpoints, those models were combined together into a consensus. But then to make them more consistent, so that the predictions also make sense, an LD50 of 500 should also have the right GHS and EPA category, for example. So all predictions were combined together into one unique consensus model. So now we have a consensus of about 140 models altogether, and using a weight of evidence approach. And you can have a little bit more information about it if you take a look at the webinar that Christy mentioned earlier in the beginning of the presentation. So we took that evaluation set that I mentioned earlier, and we used it as evaluation for the consensus predictions. Of course, the weight of evidence consensus, the latest update. And as you can see, the predictions are very highly accurate also in comparison of the in vivo balance accuracy. And that part is done using the chemicals that have multiple in vivo values, of course. So that we're able to determine how consistent those in vivo values are. And each one of the predictions is evaluated separately, but of course, as I mentioned, this is the weight of evidence prediction using the final model. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, all the 3 models are now available in the Opera suite of models. So this is an open source, free, and open data modeling suite that contains different models. So in addition to Syrup, Compara, and CAMOS, you have also physical-chemical properties, environmental fate properties, and some ADME properties as well. And this is available, as you can see, in command line and also in a user-friendly graphical interface. And it is available for the different platforms, Linux and Windows. And you can, it accepts like different input options, so that it can accommodate all sorts of possible structures, representations. And as you can see here below, it's already available on GitHub, so anyone can go ahead and download it. And just to give you an idea about what to expect on GitHub, if anyone is not very familiar with this website, is that the landing page on the Opera repository will give you the source code and some install guide and the data that was used and some general information. But to get to the executable installer file, you need to click on the releases tab, and that's where you get the latest release. So read carefully the instructions and the different installer packages that are available to choose the right one for you, and then you can download it and install it. And take a look at the installer file if it's the first time you're installing. So today, I'll be showing some examples. So I took a look at these lists that are available on the EPA website. So you can see these are lists of active chemicals and pesticides. And you can go ahead and download any of these lists, for example, to test Opera and run them through and get predictions for those. So as I mentioned, you have three options to input files into Opera. So the first and what I would recommend always is to have a text file. It's very simple. Maybe it's the simplest way to use Opera. A text file containing some ID. So it could be CAS numbers, DSS tox IDs that are the EPA DSS tox IDs coming directly from the DSS tox database, or INCHI keys. And you can also combine them together. It doesn't matter. As long as it's in one of these three IDs, Opera will process it and bring the right structure for prediction. And just for information, Opera will not connect to the internet. It already has a database of about 800,000 QSAR-ready structures. So most probably, if you have, for example, a DSS tox ID, means it's coming from DSS tox, Opera already has that structure. So a text file with those IDs will suffice. Otherwise, if you have the structures in one of these two other formats, like SMILES or SDF, you can also do that. So for SMILES, again, it's also a just simple text file. So you can make it very easily, starting from an Excel file. You copy paste the SMILES structures column, and you can add to it as a tab delimited other column, the CAS, for example, or any other ID, and it's optional. You can also have it just with SMILES structures, one SMILES per row, and save it as a .smi, and that's your SMILES file. SDF files, that's for users who want to include coordinates. And here we have two options. So you have SDF V3000 and SDF 2000, and not to confuse this with 2D and 3D. Both of them can contain 2D or 3D coordinates. But the difference is that the V3000 is the newer version, and it contains some additional information. For that one, it requires standardization, as most of, including Opera, previous versions, most QSAR suites will only use V2000. They will not be able to process V3000. But as you probably noticed in the previous slide, that the new Opera graphical interface now contains this standardized option. So in the previous version, it was gray, and when you click on it, it was showing coming soon. So now it's here, and this is the biggest development that we have right now. It's available in the latest version, 2.6 of Opera. So what this does is it processes your initial structures into a QSOR-ready structure. So it will make them standard into like their tautomers, their isomers. It will make sure that the right structure is used if it contains salts or solvents, for example. And if it's a mixture or some other sort of or inorganic or some other sort of structure that cannot be predicted, it will remove it from the initial list and it will continue running. So previous versions, if one of the structures is corrupt, the whole prediction process will stop until you remove it or you fix it. But now with this standardization option, it will process it and correct it if possible. Otherwise, it will just remove it. So this QSOR-ready workflow, we've been working on it for a few years now. It started with syrup, and now it's really a whole process combining different tools and involved a lot of people into development and design. And now it's also available for use separately from Opera. So you can take a look at the GitHub repository, and it's also available in LineHub and also as a Docker container from Docker Hub. In Opera, it's already integrated as a pre-configured tool with what Opera requires as settings. But if you want to use it separately, because for example, Opera only uses 2D structures, but this workflow has a lot more additional capabilities like dealing with 3D structures and generating 3D structures for 3D modeling. You can use this tool and configure it to meet your modeling needs. So for the lists that were mentioned earlier, you probably noticed that if I go back here, we started from 510 and we only got 464 structures as final standardized structures. And that's because some of them cannot be predicted. So in the output of Opera standardization tool, you would have this standardization log that shows you which chemicals passed standardization, the structures before and after standardization, and also some of the removed structures or failed. And you'll see the error why those chemicals were removed. For example, some of these are inorganic, so they cannot be predicted using any of the Opera models. Some of them are mixtures, like you can see some of the structures that contain multiple options and multiple possibilities. So those are called Marcouche structures. So one structure contains different options, or some inorganics or metalloorganics, and some of them do not even have any structure. It is just DSS-Tox ID without any structure. So the Opera does run, and it doesn't stop on those empty entries. This standardization workflow is really required.
So this slide shows examples of predictions from Opera for the 3 consensus models from the 3 collaborative projects, Syrup, Compara, and Catmus. It is showing 5 single chemicals that were predicted using the 3 models. You have their CAS numbers as identifiers, so that's what can be used as input to the Opera graphical interface or command line if there are no structures. And if there are any structures, it will be used as the default to making the predictions. So for Syrup and Compara, you have agonist, antagonist, and binding activity. And those are 3 separate models, but were used as consensus models. And then Catmus, for Catmus, you have the 5 consensus models as very toxic, non-toxic, EPI, GHS, and the LD50 predictions. So for CATMOS specifically here, we only show the LD50 prediction by using the graphical interface or the command line. You'll get predictions also for the classification consensus models, and they're all consistent and coherent among each other. So for using the tool itself, Opera, I mean, you can also get the 5 nearest neighbors for each one of the predictions, as well as applicability domain and confidence level that shows the accuracy estimate for each one of the predictions. For CATMOS, you also see the range or confidence interval, and that's the last column on this table. And that shows that is based on the variability analysis of the data that was initially used to train the different models. And it shows like how variable the LD50 can be if you repeat the same experiment. And that's consistent with the animal data that was used to train the models. For example, the first chemical has an LD50 of 2,568 milligram per kilogram, and that might vary between 1,300 and 5,100 milligram per kilogram. And so the model, as you can see here, when you compare the experimental value to the predicted LD50, you see a very high consistency. But the model, of course, can also predict chemicals where we don't have any data, like the fifth example, where the chemical is very toxic and the model recognizes it as such, predicting an LD50 of 2.26 and varying from 1 to 4.5 milligram per kilogram. That chemical is also an active ER binder, a weak active ER binding, just for information. And you can also get, of course, other predictions and other models from Opera, but this is just a summary of the 3 models that were mentioned in this talk.
Opera will also, in addition to those predictions and experimental values, will also provide, as you can see in the GUI options, nearest neighbors, for example, the most similar chemicals to the chemical that you are predicting. It also provides applicability domain, a local applicability domain index, and a confidence level that shows the accuracy. And we have numeric reports for most of the models, and we're now working on one for CATMOS, and maybe later on for SIRAP and Compara. And just as I showed how to use Opera to make predictions, new predictions locally on your own computer after installing it locally on your using the desktop version, you can also take a look at the existing predictions online. So one option for that is the NTP-ICE dashboard, where you can put your cast numbers, select which models you wanna get a prediction for, and then get your predictions for the chemical. So these are the 5 same chemicals as I showed earlier, and these are processed and predicted chemicals that are stored in the ICE database. And same for the API dashboard, but only for the API dashboard, it still doesn't have the CATMOS predictions, but it has Compara and SIRAP included in it. And both dashboards will soon have a possibility to make predictions on the fly as well for new chemicals that are not in their own databases and pre-stored using Opera. With that, I got to the last couple slides. So this was really work of a lot of people, spent a lot of time doing it, helping us with these 3 projects. And it was really thanks to all of them, and thanks to everyone who contributed to these 3 projects and made this possible. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Mansouri. I have to say, I'm always impressed by the modeling work done by you and your group. It's every year there's a new model available, and they're always publicly available, which is really nice for people to be able to access them. And they're very useful as well, which I think it speaks to the work of your group. So we don't have any questions that have come through yet. I'm sure someone has a question out there. Let me, while you are typing your questions, there we go. Okay, so if the EPA dashboard showed the same results for CREP and Compara, why is it sometimes different in Opera? And why do the nearest neighbors not always have experimental data? So 2 questions there.
For CREP and Compara, the predictions should be the same in using Opera, standalone, or on the EPA dashboard. So if they are different, it could be while one of them is being updated. So for example, I know in the January time, like at the end of the year, so that's when we try to make all the big updates. So it could be that Opera was updated, the standalone, but the EPA dashboard took a little bit longer to upload all those predictions. So it was maybe available a month or 2 later. But if you try now, I think now all the new predictions are uploaded and it should show the same prediction. And really what was updated this year in January was some steps of the QSO ready standardization process. So it changed a little bit for certain chemicals, but for most of them, it was the same. Remind me, what's this second part, please? Christy, can you please tell me what's the second part of the question? I forgot.
Sure, sorry about that. It was about the nearest neighbors and why they don't always have experimental data.
So for all Opera models, the experimental data is available for the nearest neighbors. So and it should be available. Again, some of the nearest neighbors on the EPA dashboard are being, or the structures themselves are being updated. So I know they are working on different representations. So sometimes one of the neighbors will be removed and then added again. So there are always certain updates. However, for CatMos, some of the neighbors will not have an experimental value, because in CatMos, the way we designed the consensus model is just it uses the predictions of the chemicals that were in the prediction set initially. So those were combined together, and for some of the new predictions where we don't have an existing prediction for those, we used the extended model or the extended consensus that uses all the different predictions together, and then tries to, using a distance-based similarity to the existing predictions, tries to make a new estimate. So that's why in some cases you don't have an experimental value for CatMos. And also, some of the experimental values are being updated, and also like we add more accurate experimental values and maybe remove some of the ranges, the existing ranges. So that could be also reason why certain nearest neighbors have different experimental values. Like some will have ranges and some will have an exact LD50, for example.
Okay, got it. Great, thanks. A question about whether the applicability domain is integrated into the consensus predictions.
Yes, it is. So just for any of the other models, every prediction is associated with an applicability domain. So it's a binary 0 or 1 applicability domain, and that takes into consideration the whole knowledge base of that specific model. And then you have a local applicability domain index, which varies from 0 to 1. The higher, the better, of course. And that represents the similarity, both structurally and biologically, to the 5 nearest neighbors. So it considers only the 5 nearest neighbors. And then a confidence level or an estimate of accuracy of that prediction based on how well is that we think that that prediction is. So all those 3 pieces of information are available for every model in Opera. And they are available separately, for example, for syrup and compara for each binding and agonist and antagonist.
Okay, great. I have quite a few questions. I'm going to try to combine some of them. So two of them are related to metabolism and ADME. So just in general, are the models taking metabolism into account? And what are some of the ADME properties that might be included in Opera?
Okay, so for Opera, the ADME properties that we have right now are the fraction unbound and intrinsic clearance. So those are the 2 properties that we have. But in general, the only model right now that it contains information that it embeds information about metabolites is compara. So that's the only maybe test case scenario where we try to include in silico generated metabolites into the process. We do not include metabolites in any of the other models, just because it requires some separate efforts to generate those metabolites, and they are not generated in Opera. Opera does not generate metabolites itself. That's a completely different process. And you can learn a little bit more about it in the Compara publication that was recently published, maybe in January or February on EHP.
Okay. I think the answer to this is yes, at least somewhat, but I'm going to check to be sure. Can Opera predict the potency of endocrine disruptors?
Yeah. So the potency, let me show you right here. So for the ER and AR, you have agonist, antagonist, and binding. So it will be just active and inactive. In syrup only, we were able to make continuous predictions onto how potent, like different levels of potency. In Compara, it was a lot more difficult, so we were not able to have any consensus model for different levels of potency. But in syrup, you have different levels.
Okay.
But for the experimental values, as you can see, you have whether if it's active, you'll see that it says if it's weak or strong or moderate or very weak and things like that. Also on the EPA dashboard, you can see that.
Great. It's a very practical question. Which do you recommend or where do you recommend, I guess, going to conduct these endpoints? Opera, ICE, or the EPA dashboard?
So it really depends on the goal. So Opera is really, I mean, the desktop version is really made for those who want to have it installed locally and run their structures by themselves. It runs locally. It does not make any connection to the internet. So you can safely also use it for like in any of the development phases. For example, if you're developing a new chemical, it will not send anything anywhere. Not that the other tools do, but just it runs completely offline. And you will have to input a file. So you will have to have your cast numbers or structures in a file and then process that file. The other two tools, the NTP ICE and the EPA dashboard, you only need the IDs. You only need your cast numbers, for example, and you'll be able to retrieve the predicted or saved predictions. So this is for now, at least. It will probably be available sometime soon that you can also run new structures, or you just put in your new structures and get predictions. But for now, it's a query to the database. So all these predictions are already stored in both databases separately, and you can only retrieve one of those predictions. So that's really the difference. I mean, it depends on your goal, what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, and just a quick sort of follow-on to that regarding installation. Is there a way to install this in a portable mode without administration rights? I assume they mean sort of on their computer.
Yeah, so Opera will require, just like when you install Java for the first time, it will require admin rights to install it locally, because it will install the runtime as well, and that interacts directly with the system. So that's why it requires admin rights to install. But once it's installed, you can run it without admin rights, of course. I hope I answered the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. There are a couple of questions about regulatory acceptance. Could you maybe spend just a minute talking about how have you had regulatory agencies use this information? Do you know anything about their application for any regulatory, like EPA or another agency?
Yeah, we encourage using them to help with the regulatory decisions. So I know for syrup, which was of course the earliest project, some of the predictions are already being used and you can check online also on some of the EPA website pages that it's already being used for certain regulatory decisions helping process. We hope Compara and Catmos will be also used soon, but we are, for example, for Catmos, we are right now collaborating with certain agencies to help them with the use and also the evaluation of the predictions and things like that. So hopefully very soon all these three collaborative projects will help with the regulatory processes and will make things easier for regulators.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we're happy. I mean, we're really happy to help any agency use these tools and provide additional information And all these models are really transparent. I mean, the publications are out there. There's another publication coming soon, hopefully about Camus, and all the data is available, QMRF reports, and the code source for Opera is also available with its data.
Great. And I think what we'll do is share links to those publications in the sort of follow-up email that you all will all receive.
Yeah.
So I know.
Yeah. So for the three. Yeah. So for the three models, I mean, sorry, Christy. There are links for the three publications, at least the ones that are available right now, and any other publications about Opera and the other tools will be, we can share them as well. Right.
So we had quite a few questions we did not get to. I apologize, all of you. I think there were a few questions related to the weight of evidence, sort of how you combine all of the models. And so I wanted to see if maybe in, a minute or so, you can kind of just give a high level answer for how, maybe it's different for each of the models, but sort of what was the approach you used to combine the models and that weight of to come up with that weight of evidence consensus. Yeah, that's right. Good.
Yeah, so I think they're talking about this step number 2 here.
Yeah.
So maybe in 2 words, when you have a prediction of LD50, for example, it's 50, then it needs to be in API category 1, and then also corresponding category GHS and a certain prediction VT and NT. So we take, since we have 5, and it's actually very convenient that we have 5 so that we don't have equal cases. But so, for example, when all of them or 4 of them agree and there is one of them that is disagreeing, then we make adjustments to that specific maybe little bit outlier prediction to make it consistent with the other majority of the model. So that's why it's called based on a majority rule. But to have more information, I invite you to take a look at the recorded webinar that Christy mentioned earlier and provided a link for. And that really explains step by step how this weight of evidence was developed with some examples as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, we will again include the links to that webinar in the follow-up email. I really appreciate Dr. Mansouri, you giving this presentation for us, and I appreciate all of your attention and questions, and we will try to send along, for those of you that didn't get your questions answered afterwards, we'll send along by email some responses. So with that, I'll close the webinar. Thank you all again very much, and hope you have a great week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.